Going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to speak just very briefly and then throw it to them. Then we'll take your Q&A. So to my left is Nizar Farsakh, who is the chair of the board of the Museum of the Palestinian People. He's also a trainer that focuses on negotiations, leadership, and advocacy. He used to work at the PLO mission here in DC. He was also the general director of the PLO mission here in DC. He also worked at the Negotiation Support Unit, helping Palestinian negotiators in Palestine. To his left is Rula Bouadeh, who is a PR and event planner. She is from Jerusalem. She worked for a variety of very important organizations that work for Palestine. When she lived in Jerusalem, she worked for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Palestinian People. She worked at the Palestinian Ministry of Economy. When she was in Michigan, she also worked on a dialogue group between Palestinians and Jewish women, and she is now working for helping Anira with some planning here in DC. And to her left, we have Omar Baddar, who is the deputy director of the Arab American Institute. Before that, he was the director of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee's Massachusetts chapter, and he also worked for Al Jazeera's The Stream as a presenter and a producer before that. So please help me in welcoming our panelists. So I'm going to speak very briefly about the general Palestinian narratives and Palestinian identity and how Palestinians view solutions to the conflict and how to get there. And then it's going to be a very crude general view of this story, and then we're going to go to our speakers who are going to shed a lot of nuance into the different narratives and different and complex experiences of Palestinians in different places, and how that has impacted their views towards solutions and towards activism to get to these solutions. So in the 1930s to before 1948, which was when Israel was established and when the Palestinians were displaced from their home, you had a Palestinian identity that was very fluid. It was interconnected with a lot of other identities, overlapping identities, Arab, regional identities. It was never viewed as something mutually exclusive. The Palestinian identity, though, was formed more and more in the late 30s. There were a lot of it had to do with forming a Palestinian identity in relation to the British mandate, the British occupation of Palestine at the time, and in response to the Zionist movement, which was viewed by Palestinians in the Palestinian narrative at the time as an extension of European colonialist movements. 1948 was a big blow to the Palestinian movement, and in many ways it fragmented the leadership, and a lot of the expressions of this identity became dormant. Palestinians more and more were reliant on Arabs to kind of advocate for their situation, specifically the Egyptians and the Jordanians. Between 1948 and 1967, you had slowly in the late 50s, there was the emergence of Fatah as a Palestinian nationalist movement. But really, in 1967, after that was considered a blow to the Arabs. So 1948 was a big blow to the Palestinians. 1967 was a big blow to the Arabs. And after that defeat, there was a void, and that void was filled by the Palestinian movement, Palestinian activists, nationalistic movement in Fatah. The PLO was founded later, and between 1967 and the first Intifada in 88 or 87, you had basically two main movements in Palestine. You had the PLO, the Fatah, the nationalists, and you had the leftists, the PFLP, the DFLPs, and those were generally the main kind of movements. And then you slowly had the emergence in the 70s of a Muslim Brotherhood type that later became Hamas and Jihad and then Hamas. So by the first Intifada, you had these three distinct groups. Really, between then and now, there haven't been any new actors who've come to the fore. There haven't been any leaders that don't belong to either of these three categories. And if you look at them, the only difference is that the percentage of people who support one or the other just fluctuates. So whereas you had a higher people who were lefty, who were, after the Fatah, there were the leftists, and then Hamas, and now the kind of the numbers have shifted away from the left and perhaps more towards Hamas, and more people are becoming disillusioned and say they just don't belong to any of these groups. So that's the general kind of views, and with that come three main solutions. The two-state solution, which has the support right now, polls show, of 48% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. You have this Islamic kind of view of Palestinians are supposed to control all of this area, and if the Jews want to live there, they can live under Islamic rule. This doesn't really have much support, but that's considered another kind of one of these other narratives that you hear. Pretty low support for that. I don't even think that it's even asked in polls. And then the one-state solution, which generally we understand here to mean one person, one vote, full equality. Right now, polls show that it gets about 28% support from Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, an important distinction. In terms of kind of where the Palestinian movement is right now, you had different solutions that have all failed. You've had joining an Arab country or being part of a bigger kind of Arab presence. That one has failed. The two-state solution, both through armed struggle and through peace negotiations, has failed. The one-state solution really requires the acquiescence of the other side, and you don't have any support from the Israeli side, and there are no Palestinian leaders who are advocating this. So there's not really an inside Palestine movement. So you have a lot of fragmentation and a lot of failure right now. Palestinians have failed to internally build the institutions that they need for statehood. And on the other hand, they've failed in the liberation of Palestine. So where do we go from here? Are there any new ideas? Are there any ways to reach either any of these solutions or another solution that would be considered better? I don't know. I'm going to leave that to our panelists. So I'm going to start with Nizar, who's going to tell us a little bit more in more nuance about the different narratives that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip have. And he specifically has a really interesting kind of backstory that he grew up in the Gulf, lived in the United States, and lived in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And that kind of changed his views about a lot of the solutions that are possible, because he kind of has a good view of how different Palestinian experiences have shaped the way that they want to go forward. So Nizar, I'll give it to you.
Thank you, Muna, and thank you for hitting on all the key, I think, points historically that are relevant to understand this current discussion. So what I'll be covering is a bit more on the narratives. So how do we make sense of the events that happen? Because events happen, but how we make sense of them is really up to us. And often what gets missed in analyzing Palestine and Israel is those narratives. People assume a dichotomy of narratives, when in fact the narratives are far more complex. I would just pitch a TED Talk that I think is phenomenal, called The Dangers of the Singular Story by Chimamanda. It's an excellent TED Talk about how, in fact, the danger is essentializing and reducing a people to one story. In the case of the Palestinians, either terrorists or victims. Both are problematic because both reduce us to one thing, and that is in and of itself dehumanizing. Even when we say Palestinians are superstars, that is dehumanizing because it's not seeing the richness of that population. So I'm going to present different narratives that influence and inform, let's say, the Palestinian polity. As Muna said, I'm going to use my own example. I was born and raised in Dubai. My father is from a village called Birzeit in the West Bank. I remember very well we used to always, of course, send money to Palestine, to our relatives who are there. My aunt, she was the only one who managed to stay there and save literally our pieces of land. Because she was there, she was able to protect them. So we always had this sense of debt as diaspora Palestinians for the Palestinians that are there. Who are we to tell them what to do? And we just need to support them, right? At the same time, we didn't used to say Israel. We used to say 1948 areas. And one of the first things that really shocked me, let's say, or like really surprised me when I first moved there in 1999 is discovering that my cousins call it Israel, right? My cousins who live in Birzeit, they say Israel. Like, I would actually correct people and say, no, we should say 1948. And then I was like, that had tension with, they are more Palestinian than I am because they are the ones who suffered. Who am I to tell them to call it Israel or call it 1948? So that was the first, let's say, experience of dissonance of those different Palestinian perspectives that forced me to realize that there's more to our story than that singular story. They kicked us out, and we need to go back. Another one was, before that, when I was in school in Dubai, my chemistry teacher, which I was very fond of, she was from Akka. And when we signed the agreement, when we declared our state in 1988 in Algiers, we celebrated. Finally, now we're going to have our state, what have you. And I remember she wasn't happy at all. And she was saying, well, good luck with that state. I hope you're happy now, right? And it dawned to me that she's not happy with that solution because it came at her expense, right? So there's that narrative of the statehood, right? Palestinian statehood being at the expense of a return and at the expense of that right of return, that a solution is actually going to be at the disadvantage of another group of Palestinians, when in fact the majority of Palestinians are refugees. So again, realizing that our story is much more complex than what we make it, often reduce it to. Another side of the element is of that, again, Palestinian experience is how we describe ourselves, right? So Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Palestinians in Lebanon, Palestinians in Syria and Jordan. We happen to be from the West Bank, and we happen to be my father happened to be in Jordan in 1967, so he was registered as a Jordanian. So we had the 5-year full-fledged Jordanian passport, right? While Palestinians who were in the West Bank got the 2-year passport. And that in of itself was kind of a class. And when we would meet people, and like when I was young and we would go to Europe and people ask where I was from, I would just say I was from Jordan. It was just too complicated to say I was from Palestine. Like every time I would say Palestine, they think Pakistan, right? So that experience of having to explain your identity and that you're not known, and like having to tell your story and realize that people don't know that you actually exist, right? That's another part that in the Arab world had its own implications. Like in Jordan, whether you said you're Palestinian or Jordanian, and all the implications of that. Another aspect of the narratives is this refugee, not refugee description or attribution. So one of the things that people often don't realize is that in the first Intifada, for example, there's this narrative of like statistically speaking, Palestinian refugees were much more engaged in the Intifada than Palestinians who were not refugees, who were from villages. And part of it is just refugees had less to lose. They didn't have land, they didn't have assets, right? So that's part of it. But it was part of the narrative. And it kind of also manifests itself between Gaza and the West Bank, because Gaza has a greater proportion of refugees than it has Gazans who are originally from Gaza, and that created also another class where my aunt, who is from Birzeit, activists used to hide, Palestinian stone throwers and activists in her house. Took issue with my cousin marrying a guy from the refugee next door, which is Jalazon, and said, like, oh, but he's a refugee, right? Like, she's a nationalist, but then when it came to my cousin getting married, like that was an issue, right? All of these, and that also reflects itself in the politics. So even in the politics of Hamas and Fatah, there is that Gaza, West Bank, let's say, divide, dichotomy. Within the PA itself, there are the Gazans who take care of each other, right? And part of the rift now with the way the PA in Ramallah is dealing with Gaza is that it is coming at the expense of the Fatah people in Gaza who are, we're not sure where they lie and whether we want to help them or like they are now a liability. So these are the kinds of complexities that are necessary if you want to really understand the Palestinian dynamic, to understand where all of that is coming from, understand why people vote one way or the other. The last one I would mention is what Mona said, is this evolution of, or introduction of the Islamic narrative, right? Whether are we Palestinian Muslims or are we Muslims that happen to be Palestinians? Which identity is more important? I've had conversations with Palestinian friends of mine from towns who are half Christian, half Muslim, and he would tell me, I feel closer and feel more pain for my Afghani Muslim brother than for my Christian neighbor, right? So for him, and for me it was a shock, like you're actually in the same village suffering from the same occupation, and yet you see the Afghani Muslim closer to you than the Christian neighbor. So again, if we don't understand those complexities, we misdiagnose what's happening in Palestine, and that's, in my opinion, one of the key blind spots that American policymakers and the city specifically often misses when they're analyzing the Palestine-Israeli conflict.
Nizar, I'm going to ask you some more follow-up questions, but first I'm going to go to Rula. Rula is going to tell us a little bit more about the experience of Palestinians in Jerusalem and what their experiences, positive and negative, has meant for how they see themselves and where they see this conflict going and where they'd like it to go. So you could probably use that mic.
Okay, it works. Hi. Preparing my narrative, I realized that I grew up listening to my grandparents' life, reminiscing about life before 48, and I grew up listening to my parents talk about Palestinian life before 1967, and now I'm talking about life as I know it before 1988 and the peace process and the closures. My dad and my grandfather were all Jerusalemites. My dad and his family were forced to leave the Ottoman area in Jerusalem in 1948, and then they established residency in East Jerusalem. They were refugees, but they did not go to refugee camps. My dad was able to build a business and get education and have a good life in Jerusalem. He had a very successful business in clothes design. He had tailors and a department store. They even used to, that's my dad reminiscing before 67. They even used to have fashion shows at the National Hotel in Jerusalem, where people, dignitaries and Tahiyya Koryaka, the actors from Egypt and Jordan would come to the fashion shows that my dad would hold at the National Hotel. That was pre-1967, and that was when I was born. After 67, of course, the economic life was struggled a lot. My dad was one of the first people I ever knew who closed the shop and would not work with Israelis. He was one of the first Bds movement that I ever heard of before BDS even existed. When later in life I was hired to work for Hanan Ashrawi in the peace talks, and when I was interviewed with Faisal Husseini, he knew who my dad was, and he said, oh, he was the only one who closed his shop and stood outside and refused to deal with the Israeli influx that came in 1967. Of course, life, the economic life was struggled, and we were closed off from Jordan and from our families in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria. But we still have a good life in East Jerusalem. We grew up going to Catholic missionary schools in Jerusalem. My school was right outside the wall of the old city. After school, I would go with my friends and go to the old city and get pastries and do some shopping, or go to the famous Salah ad-Din Street, which was our main life, the vibrant social, economical, full city in streets. We had 2 movie theaters. We would go to the movies. We would go to restaurants, bookstores. And Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Gaza would all come to Jerusalem for economics and shopping and doctor appointments and all that. We would, Sundays we would go to the Holy Sepulchre for church, and my dad would bribe us to go to Zalatimo and have pastries. We would go to visit my aunt in the old city, inside the walls of the old city. Summers, my parents would rent a chalet or get a hotel in Gaza, and we would go with other families and stay in a hotel. Imagine now, thinking of Gaza in the 70s, this was our vacation. We used to go to the beach, eat seafood, and have our, the Florida that people knew here. The peace process started. National Authority headquarters was in the Orient House. In 1991, I was there when the Madrid peace talks started. And I saw those kids, those Palestinian children in the streets, handing olive branches to the soldiers who were fighting them a couple of days before. Thinking back now, I'm thinking of how naive we were as Palestinians, how naive we were thinking that peace will actually come, and forgiving and forgetting so easily, handing olive branches to the soldiers who used to shoot us and put checkpoints outside our homes. So just to talk a little bit about how life changed in Gaza now. So during the peace process, people think the peace process, things will get better. Israel systematically built more settlements. They followed the policy of ethnic cleansing, suffocating the city culturally and economically. In addition to land grab, you see Jewish settlements, Jewish settlers occupying Palestinian homes in Sheikh Jarrah. We've never seen, we lived in East Jerusalem, and we never in the past seen settlers occupying homes in the middle of the Palestinian neighborhoods. They, of course, refused to give building permits to Palestinians. They demolish homes, revoking residencies for Jerusalemites, and not providing the public services that we pay taxes for. Trash collections, health centers, garbage collectors, and security, this never happened. Closing of the West Bank suffocated the cultural and economic life in Jerusalem. You walk at night in East Jerusalem, and instead of seeing the vibrant city, you see a ghost town that lives off the NGOs and the diplomatic missions. Through closures, checkpoints, and also the off-limit highways that they built on our streets, they managed to tear the fabric of the Palestinian society. First, Gaza was separated, then the West Bank, the Northwest Bank from the Southwest Bank, and each city became an entity, and therefore even how Palestinians relate to other cities became fragmented. The whole fabric of the society was dismantled. West Bankers cannot enter Jerusalem for the past 20 years. There are generations of people who live in Ramallah, 10 minutes away from Jerusalem, have never been to Jerusalem. The main issue one of the main issues for Jerusalemites is how to keep their IDs, how to stay living in the city despite the economic problems that the city have, despite the lack of building permits, and despite the checkpoints and being able to go to Ramallah. So.
Thank you, Rana. That's a very interesting and depressing perspective.
It is depressing, I'm sorry, but it affects everything you do. It affects where you choose to live, where you choose to work, where you send your friends, and who you decide to marry.
Right.
Once one of the a cab driver I was talking to, he mentioned that having Jerusalem ID is so important to him. It's easier to marry someone he likes that's Jerusalemite than marrying the one he loves in Ramallah, because having a West Banker ID
would restrict his work. Yeah. All right, thank you, Rula. I'm going to also follow up with you later, but I'm going to go to Omar now to tell us a little bit more about the experience of Palestinians in the diaspora, and specifically here in the United States, how their narratives determine their views of a solution as well.
Thank you, Mona. I suppose I should start by noting a couple of things. I think there is, in one sense, the Palestinians are divided and diverse and have varying perspectives and are more complex than we can appreciate, in the sense of the divisions that we talked about, which is the Zionist project's success in effectively putting some Palestinians under occupation, others living as second-class citizens within Israel, others are refugees, and even within these categories, there are all kinds of different levels of separation. That division that's one aspect of it, but I think that there's another aspect of the complexity of Palestinian narratives, which is identical to the complexity that exists within any society. I mean, even when you look at the United States, you ask, what is the American perspective on the world? Is that the perspective of Donald Trump, or is that the perspective of the people resisting Trump? Obviously, both of these are American perspectives, and so in that sense, that diversity exists everywhere. Or when Trump is separating families at the border and taking children away from their parents, you have one camp saying, this is not who we are better than this. And you have other people saying, what are you talking about? The US has a very lengthy history of racist oppression of all kinds of people. This is exactly who we are. And in a sense, both are correct. Both of these things are fundamentally American. The aspirational identity for being fair, as well as the history that we have yet to fully wrestle with about what we had done in our past. And I think that that's absolutely true of the Palestinian perspective. No one particular group or political perspective represents the Palestinian perspective. In the occupied territories, that division, I think, is more obvious in terms of Fatah versus Hamas as the two largest political parties. They're both losing traction and public support very quickly, and for a very good reason, because neither of them is producing a coherent strategy about how to move basically Palestinians' aspirations forward. And it's funny how that ends up being superimposed on Palestinians in the US to some extent as well. I remember a Palestinian official was here speaking to Palestinian Americans not that long ago when there were hopes for Hamas-Fatah reconciliation. And that official was addressing Palestinian Americans in the room and talking to us about how it's important to overcome our divisions and come together because it's the time to. And I raised my hand and I said, I don't think anybody in this room identifies either as Fatah or Hamas. We don't have these loyalties. And he was genuinely surprised. And frankly, I don't think he believed me. He thought I was just being obnoxious and trying to be contrarian or something. But this is not the scene that we have here. I think what divides Palestinians in the United States, Palestinian Americans, really is a diversity of strategies on how to advocate for Palestine that ends up sometimes having the appearance of being a variation in ideology or vision. So I think the most common thing that used to come up a lot more often than it does today is the one-state, two-state debate. Are you a one-stater or are you a two-stater? Well, frankly, that's ultimately a strategic difference because any Palestinian who advocates for a two-state solution, if you ask them, what do you think about the one-state solution, they'll tell you, I support it, it's wonderful. Obviously, the idea of a Palestinian being able to visit any part of historic Palestine and going to Haifa and Akka and so on, that seems to be more just than confining Palestinians to just 22% of historic Palestine. But the issue was not whether that vision was shared, the issue was always about whether that vision was actually feasible. So within the political constraints that exist in the world today, what can we realistically aspire to and what strategy can we move forward that we have chances of actually achieving? And I think that you can sometimes see a little bit of that in the other direction as well. You have a lot of people who say we need to advocate in a practical manner for Palestinians and see what we can advance, but you just have to accept the reality that 750,000 settlers throughout the West Bank and East Jerusalem has put us in a situation where the two-state solution is no longer practical. And so you see that strategic tension over there playing out as an ideological tension, which I don't think it is. And I think that one-state, two-state debate was much more salient, maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago or somewhere during that period. And I think that it's losing salience right now due to the fact that we don't really have a roadmap that clearly leads us in either direction as things stand. It is true that the two-state solution, especially with the rate of settlement expansion, with Netanyahu's coalition leading in Israel, with Donald Trump as an American president, that not only enables Israel's violence and colonialism in the Palestinian territories, but in effect has made the U.S. a participant in it rather than just an enabler of it. We don't really have the prospect of reaching an end to the occupation in the short term under these conditions. But the other argument, I think, is equally strong, is that if you can't achieve Palestinian freedom in 22% of historic Palestine, how is it more practical to start shooting for Palestinian freedom in 100% of historic Palestine? That seems to be a more ambitious goal rather than less ambitious. And in light of this stuck between a rock and a hard place kind of situation, I think right now there's a movement in the United States to set that vision aside and focus on a human rights approach of the fact that what we're advocating for is a change in US policy so that we're no longer enabling Israel's bad behavior. A change we have bills coming across shooting for ending US military financial support for the detention of children in Palestine by the Israeli military. We have the first bill coming through that's unprecedented in American politics. Betty McCollum is the congresswoman who's pushing that bill forward. And you have efforts to push forward a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more about. And now I think the tension, the divisions that exist are once again strategic about who is considered an ally and who is considered an opponent, and what your threshold for accepting how wide that movement needs to be, so that somebody who identifies as a Zionist, says they are a supporter of the State of Israel, but also strongly opposes the occupation and believes in applying pressure on Israel in order to force it to abide by international law. Is that person an ally or is that an opponent? And you think that you see this kind of tension is currently what we're witnessing. And from my personal perspective is that I think I'm always in favor of as wide a net as possible because we are facing an absolutely tremendous injustice in Palestine, and it's going to take every ally and every possible effort we can add in order to move things in a better direction. And from that perspective, I think we can certainly debate and disagree and make a better case for one strategy over another. But at the end of the day, as long as people believe in the basics, which is that Israel is oppressing the Palestinians, that pressure has to be applied to change that, and no actions are taken to undermine any of the narrative or the efforts that other groups are engaging in, to me, that's good enough to say that you're a part of this movement that is trying to advocate for justice in Palestine.
Thank you so much, Ahmad. So I'm going to ask Nizad actually this question because he used to work at the PLO mission and it seems like there's sometimes a disconnect between Palestinian activists here in the United States and between what the actual Palestinian Authority and the PLO, which is now generally one entity, or has become one entity, and what they want. It seems like a lot of the groups, for example, are asking me, well, what does the PLO, why aren't we getting guidance from them on the strategy? What can we do to help the Palestinians? And they never really get an answer. So we know that they are not advocating for the one-state solution, but why is there no kind of guidance for what the Palestinians' leadership wants the Palestinians in America to do? And is that even a question that I should be asking? Because is it up to them, or should the activists kind of be like, I really, I think you're a corrupt organization and I don't want to take any guidance from you?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's the point. Is the PLO representative or not? That's basically the point, right? We said the majority of Palestinians are refugees, are, in a sense, not necessarily invested in a two-state solution because they have more to lose, let's say. But that's not necessarily so. Like Abu Mazen himself is from Safad, which is in the Galilee, and he himself said that I would like to visit Safad, but I'm happy to have a two-state solution where I will have visitation rights to Safad, but I don't want to go live there, right? So he was trying to embody that narrative of the two states. And building on what Omar said, I think that's really critical. Like the narratives have more to do with the strategies, right? So it was unfathomable in the 70s to talk about the two-state solution. It was treacherous. You were a traitor if you talked about the two-state solution. And kind of similar to your father, I met this guy in Jerusalem whose father was talking about the two-state solution in Jerusalem back in the 60s and 70s, and he was ostracized and treated as a traitor. And then he said, like, it was in the 90s when I was speaking with him, it's like he turned out to be right. So in the 90s, it was unfathomable, or people who spoke about the one state were considered dreamers, impractical people, extremists, right? And now people who in the 2000s talk about the two-state solution, they are considered as impractical and naive, what have you. So it is about the strategy, and part of that strategy also has to do with another level, which is where is the weight of Palestinian political the political polity, right? So from 48 till 94, or arguably 88, which is the Intifada, the center of gravity of Palestinian politics was outside of Palestine, and it was by refugees. And ergo, the refugee issue was front and center. There was a strategic decision to opt for the two-state solution around the 70s and the 80s, where the PLO realized that getting a piece of land is better than getting nothing and then building from there. So the shift to the two-state solution took a decade, and the Intifada was leveraged for that purpose. And then once the Palestinian polity became inside of Palestine, and that was the argument for the huge concessions, which arguably part of the schism in the Palestinian society was over Oslo, that Oslo gave too much to the Israelis. The argument from the Arafat camp was that that is a price worth paying just to physically be in Palestine and not be at the mercy of Arab regimes who kick us out and put us at a much more vulnerable position, right? The final element to it is, again, representation, because when the PLO was in the diaspora, it was acceptable to have a representation. It was understood, and it's legitimate to realize that the representation was not exactly democratic. There were factions that were represented in the council, but there weren't actual elections, right? Now, when strategic decisions about the future of Palestine and Palestinians is being decided by the people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a lot of Palestinians are arguing that that's actually not fair. You do not have a right as a West Banker or a Gazan to decide my right as a Palestinian who's from Akka, who's living in Dubai or in the United States. And that dearth of legitimacy is, in fact, one of the big, one of the tensions that are balanced by the fact that the people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip actually, but de facto, have more weight. And that also reflects itself in Fatah and Hamas. So Hamas in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip do actually have more weight than Hamas outside, whether in Jordan or in Qatar or what have you. So that's another, let's say, layer of where you stand is where, where you are is where you stand, how it manifests itself in Palestine.
Sorry, I'm going to get you to tell me a little bit more. What is, for example, when you're talking about some of the forms of activism, boycotts, divestment, sanctions, what is the Palestinian authorities or the PLO's view towards it? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Do they have a view, a coherent view towards this? And if they did, would that help or not?
Thank you for returning to it, because I missed that point. You're right. The position is that we're still going for the two-state solution. It's the practical solution that can actually be implemented because Israel is not interested in a one-state solution. And they see boycotts as an effective tool towards that. The problem with the PA is that it lacks legitimacy with the BDS demographic. That's the main challenge, is that they agree with BDS. Of course, actually, technically speaking, according to Oslo, they're not, the PA is not supposed to engage in boycotts, but that's a technicality of Oslo, which is not implemented. But the strategy from the perspective of the PA, again, the PA in Ramallah we're talking about, right, is that they are for boycotts, but the aim is to achieve a two-state solution. Now, while at the same time, they're unable to get traction with the Palestinian diaspora because in the eyes of the Palestinian diaspora, that PA has lost its legitimacy. The change now with the Trump administration is that now that the US has explicitly and not implicitly clearly stated that it is 100% within the Israeli position, the PA is looking into how to move into the one-state solution or the threat of the one-state solution from the basis that the coherent argument for them is that we opted for the two-state solution as a historic compromise. We believe we have a right to the 100% of Palestine. We are willing to compromise and accept 22% of historic Palestine for the sake of peace. If that's no longer on the table, then we're no longer bound by it.
Thank you. And Rula, I want to ask you a little bit. You very eloquently told us the experience of Palestinians in Jerusalem and how difficult it is and how it's changed over the ages, over the years. I would like to hear more from you. What are the different solutions that Jerusalemites would like to see for their situation and for the broader conflict? And how do they want to get there? You could probably use that mic.
Sorry.
I think Jerusalemites, just like most of the West Bank, believe still in the two-state solution because they're still nostalgic about being able to travel freely within West Bank and Gaza and being able to stay in Palestine and stay in Jerusalem and get a building permit to build a house in Jerusalem and bring back the vibrant life as it used to be in Jerusalem. This might not be the perfect solution, but I think going back to Jerusalem now and seeing how people feel, this is the only hope they have in place. With the experience of trying to be Israeli citizens and being treated as second-class citizens and the discrimination that Jerusalemites feel and how they're treated as Eastern Jerusalemites versus the Israelis who live in the West, one-state solution does not seem like the right way to go because we'll still be second or third-class citizens. We still, even though we pay taxes like Israeli Jerusalemites do, we do not get the services. We don't get 10% of the services that the West, the Jews in Jerusalem get.
Right.
So looking at a one-state solution, if you use Jerusalem as a pilot study, it's not going to work out. We won't get our trash picked up. We don't get our health services. We'll be treated like ghettos within the Israeli state.
Really interesting perspective. All right, I'm going to open it up to questions. I think, Kristen, somebody going to have a mic? All right, perfect. So please ask your question and try not to give too long commentary. Just kind of ask the question and tell us if you want any of the panelists or a specific panelist to answer it. Okay? Over here. And tell us who you are really quickly.
Hi, my name is Cleo Rogers. I'm a master's student at AU. And I have two questions, so whoever wants to answer them, go ahead. The first is, where do you see the future of mediation or negotiations in regards to this conflict? The future of mediation and or negotiation in regards to this conflict. And the second question is, how do you approach the calling out or blacklisting of U.S. clergy, universities, and faculty who support the BDS?
Okay, great. So I'm going to take some more questions and then I'm going to... Okay, yes. So her questions were the future of negotiations, and the other question, how faculty and clergy who support the boycott and BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, how they're being treated, how that's viewed. Is that the right question? How you approach that. Okay, let's take a couple more questions over here.
My name is Maad. I'm a consultant at EY. I'm actually from Bds. My question is mostly for Mr. Omar, but please feel free to answer. Do you feel like the Palestinians in Palestine have reached to a point where we can declare them as failed in this whole negotiations process for the Palestinian rights? And if so, then at what stage do we give Palestinians in the diaspora legitimacy to take that struggle on, given that the percentage of Palestinians in Palestine and outside of Palestine is pretty close?
A really good question about leadership. We'll take a couple more.
So my name is Munir. I'm a Palestinian American. I was born in Gaza, mother from Jerusalem, and a father from Jaffa. So I feel like I have I can definitely identify with the different perspectives and the nuances that the panel has brought. So thank you very much for that. My question is if you would shed a little bit of light onto what you see as some of the barriers or main obstacles to a one-state solution in terms of, from the Israeli side, and what are we doing as a strategy to try and address that? Because oftentimes you just hear about the threat, but you don't hear about...
Barriers to the two or the one-state solution?
The one-state solution.
Got it.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more.
Hello, my name is David. Quick question for whomever could answer it. In the sense of urgency, do you find it is becoming counterintuitive for the PLO or the PA not to engage in the conversation nowadays, and the time that is being spent not having the conversation is actually helping the Israeli government to continue to pursue what they're doing now?
Okay, so your question is the Palestinian negotiators are basically not talking to Americans. Is that a good idea or is that counterproductive? All right, so I'm going to first go to Omar with some of the questions. If you could start by talking about the, Palestinian leadership. The Palestinians inside have failed. Do the Palestinians outside take command or not? Is that even feasible without leadership in the inside? And then if you could talk a little bit more about the faculty and clergy and BDS and any other of the questions you want to
Sure.
take on.
If you don't mind, I'm going to start with the last one just because I think it's kind of salient. Right at this moment, there's a lot of pressure about whether the Palestinians should be engaging in those negotiations or not. From my perspective, there is absolutely nothing productive that could possibly come from these negotiations. We have to understand what they are. They're not peace talks. They call them peace talks, but the word peace is just a charade. I mean, they use that word and it doesn't mean anything. These are talks about how to impose Israeli dominance over the Palestinians, but make it in a way that is palatable that Palestinians might be willing to put up with, or make it seem like it's just basically dress it up, putting a lipstick on a pig, effectively. And I think that any Palestinian participation in that process will legitimize that process and give it more legitimacy as a peace process when it absolutely is not. So when you have Netanyahu saying that there will never be a Palestinian state, and you have Trump saying, we're fine with whatever Israel does, and they're putting all the pressure on the Palestinians, and you have these people cooking up a plan together, there's absolutely no reason why the Palestinians should be a part of that. We've reached a point where it is absolutely obvious that the only way there's going to be a dynamic where talks could lead to anything productive is going to be by placing immense pressure on Israel to get it to the point to where it is interested in resolving the conflict, because right now it has absolutely no incentive. And I think as far as public relations are concerned, it is important to make that point, to discuss the history of these so-called peace negotiations and talk about the fact that the Palestinians have for decades sat on the negotiations table. Israel pretended to be negotiating while effectively on the ground taking whatever they wanted and building more and more settlements and entrenching the occupation and leaving the Palestinians with nothing. And I think it's important to get that narrative out there in order to counter the idea that the Palestinians are not participating productively in this process. On the
Leadership.
On the issue of leadership, just to go back to something that you were talking about how the loss of legitimacy within the leadership with the BDS crowd, we have to understand why that came about. the Palestinian Authority's approach to the to advancing Palestinian rights has been strictly negotiations and security coordination with the occupation and bending backwards to American and Israeli pressure, so many compromises left and right, and that has absolutely advanced nothing, right? So we can declare that that process has officially failed and it's time to switch to pressure. And so now you have this tension where on the one hand, you have a boycott and divestment and sanctions movement that is trying to place that pressure on Israel. You have the Palestinian leadership on the inside endorsing that movement while continuing to cooperate on security with the occupation and effectively doing Israel's work for it in terms of facilitating, in terms of providing security to the occupation. So much so that when Palestinians protest in the West Bank in support of the people in Gaza about electricity cuts, they end up being dealt with absolute brutality by the authorities. I mean, there's a reason why that legitimacy has been lost. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about a crisis of leadership, I don't see how the diaspora can form an alternate leadership that can lead on this. I mean, I think that when you're talking about the diaspora as a very broad, basically a broad population, we are at this point talking about a movement, a movement with a strategic vision rather than a leadership with a specific prescription. And in that sense, I think the global BDS movement is that alternative voice. It is what people can get behind to try to apply pressure in light of the loss of legitimacy on the inside. And you know, from there, we hope that we can do whatever work that we can to support the people on the inside to move the leadership in a better direction than it currently is in.
All right, now for Urula and for Nizar, I have 3 more questions. I have shed light and as what you see as the barriers to the one-state solution. Tell us a little bit about where the future of negotiations are going and how faculty and clergy who are boycotting and divestment and doing divestment, how they're being treated. So who wants to take on?
I just want to say something
Microphone,
about.
though.
I just want to say something about losing faith in the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. It's not the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. It's the leadership in the West Bank and Gaza. It's the Palestinians on the ground who actually got us to talk about peace, to got us to the negotiations, and who shed the light on what's going on in Palestine. And these are the people that I have hope in making the change, in going onto the streets and forcing the change to happen. Because as Palestinians, we lost faith in everybody else, our own leadership, in, of course, the US as a mediator, and in Israel, and in the Arab world to make a change for us. It is the Palestinians on the street who have to take their life in their own hands and make a difference. So I just wanted to mention that. It's the leadership, it's not the people. What was the question?
A couple questions on Nizar. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about
So indeed, so to explain, because it touches on several of those points, the point of legitimacy, part of, again, what people often don't understand, when I was running a training in Iraq, and a lot of I got a lot of, why do Palestinians have bad leadership, right? That's often something that we get asked. And what people seldom appreciate is that from a Palestinian perspective, as stateless people who are vulnerable literally to the whims of the regimes or the countries they are in, for example, the Palestinians in Kuwait thought that they were, they're going to stay there forever and they had a good life, and then in a whim they were out. The Palestinians in Syria, they were as close as Syrian citizens as they get. They were doctored, and then look what happened to them, right? So the experience of statelessness and the vulnerability of it is in fact central to Palestinian politics. So as much as we are critical of our leadership, the fear of lack of leadership and lack of unity is greater, right? So we put up with objectively bad leadership, right? Because the alternative is worse. It's kind of like the people who are critical of those refugees coming out of Syria. How do you put your kids in those unsafe boats? It's like, do you know where they were coming from? It's like, you should ask what would make a parent take a kid on a boat that's dangerous. So that's where a lot of the tension that we have is that as opposition, we see danger in going too far in opposition because it comes at the expense of our unity, which makes it worse. And again, we had very bad experiences with Arab regimes exploiting the Palestinian issue. So when it comes to negotiations, of course, the Palestinian leadership takes advantage. They know that they have that power, right? So when we come to Oslo, for example, the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, so Hanan Ashrawi, Faisal Husseini, Abd al-Shafi, right? They had a strategic decision to defer to the PLO because they were very clear about the importance of Palestinian unity, right? So a lot of the legitimacy of the PLO in Tunis in being able to run affairs was because while all the attention and the political gravity was in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the leaders in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were ensuring that unity. And then the PLO took advantage of that and came up with Oslo outside of that, right? So people in power are always going to do that, right? So when it comes to negotiations, there was a strategic decision to go into negotiations. And that's where, when you talk about the future of negotiations, part of the problem is when a leadership takes negotiations, which is a vehicle, and takes it as a goal, that our goal, our strategic goal is negotiations. Why is that relevant? How is that relevant to the one state? It's when the PLO and the Palestinian negotiators engaged in negotiations, they were very aware that from the Israeli perspective, the Zionist narrative is one that we as Jews have been persecuted. We will never be safe in any place if we are not a majority. There's a conception in Israel that a Jew will never have a fair trial unless the judge is Jewish, right? So being true to that experience, that as far as Jews are concerned, they feel that they need to be a majority if they are to be able to self-determine. Ergo, the two-state solution is the only solution that allows that, even if, in fact, in reality, it is a racist, basically, argument, which is having a state that is ethnically one majority so that one ethnic group has security. And therefore, when the Palestinian leadership was signaling that we are going to go into negotiations as a strategy, right, they were trying to signal to the Israelis that you are going to get your ethnically majoritarian Jewish state, right? What the Palestinians were hearing, that you are just going to negotiate until we're dead, right? So from the Palestinian public was very skeptical of a leadership that saw negotiations as a strategy in and of itself, as opposed to a vehicle. And finally, on the point of also the future of negotiations, it has to do with what's in negotiation terminology is called the BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So a key aspect of Palestinian weakness in negotiations is that they did not work on having a good alternative to negotiations. Therefore, the Israelis knew very well that the Palestinians were going nowhere and were staying on negotiation. And therefore, there was no pressure on the Israelis to deliver. And I personally experienced it, and that's why I left the negotiating team, because I experienced it firsthand, where I realized that Israelis were under no pressure. And part of BDS is to create that pressure. Now, the problem is that we don't have an articulation. As Omar said, it's just a general umbrella of support to the Palestinians. It's not articulating a vision, whether one state or other, where you can see a credible solution that can be held. At the same time, the PLO or the PA in Ramallah actually, and Hamas, actually are de facto in control. So how do you square that triangle? That's the main challenge in the future of negotiations and the one state, two state.
Thank you, Nizar. Before I take a couple more questions, I also want to kind of make a point that I think, in terms of losing legitimacy, especially here in Washington, I think we have to be careful about when we talk about that, because I think there are a lot of organizations here and directions and people in the administration who wants to exploit the fact that Palestinians are unhappy with their leadership in order to promote a vision that they think is a vision that will not give Palestinians rights, but will give them better economic conditions. So the idea is, you're unhappy with your leadership, then clearly if the leadership rejects this wonderful peace plan that we're going to come up with, it's not because Palestinians reject it, it's because their leadership rejects it. And so if we had some people, pushing them towards towards better economic benefits inside their little areas, then that's exactly what Palestinians want. So I think we need to be careful when we talk about, what it is that we don't like about our leadership. Is it the problem, corruption, etc., or, what is the alternative? Because the alternative seems to be a lot worse in that term. Sorry. Want to take a couple more questions? Okay, sir, over here, right over here. Yeah. You.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay.
I'm Stephen Stern from Mosaic Theater. The question has to do about pressure on Israelis and pressures from within Palestinian society, especially in the West Bank and Gaza, on Israelis and on its leadership. You made a statement about, Omar, about wanting a very broad coalition and then talking about global BDS. Muna, you had talked about activism and advocacy and BDS in the same sentence. I'm not sure you were saying that that's the only kind of activism and advocacy. And then Rula, you talked very eloquently about how it needs to come from within Palestinians themselves, building trust among each other and taking action within their communities to build up their strength to act through acting together and maybe put pressure on their own leaders. Could any of you comment on how all of these work together, or what are the tensions between them? Thanks.
All right. Somebody had a question over here? Yes, sir. Over here.
I'm Martin Wallen, an American who has visited Jordan, the West Bank, from Jenin to Hebron, Israel, and not Gaza, only Gaza from the Israeli firing line. My question is, we have here today Palestinians concerned with American oppression. You also have American Jewish groups. How come would it be advisable, desirable, particularly in today's day, for some combination? In other words, I've seen, like myself, an American and Jew who's been welcomed into the West Bank, but I don't see American groups. I see Palestinian groups and I see Jewish groups, but I don't see them working together. Would it be desirable? And if it would be desirable, what are the obstacles to those who share a common goal of a viable Palestinian state working together in the future?
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. Ma'am, over there.
There's been a lot of discussion about the Gulf states working with Israel and sort of losing the Palestinians along the way. What's the perspective of any of the panelists on how this could play out and how the Palestinians can counteract some of that negative influence?
Great. One more question. Yes, ma'am, over here.
Deborah Jones, former U.S. Ambassador to Libya and Kuwait, and also, I was the Jordan desk officer during Wadi Arava. So we all had a lot of hope and a lot of disappointment along the way. You've addressed part of my question, which was going to be, what will the response be if Jared rolls out a plan with the support of Mohammed bin Salman, and this administration just kind of rolls with it because they say it's time to cut and run, So what, if a decision is made, who makes that decision on behalf of the Palestinians, and what kind of acceptance does it find? Because I have to tell you, my big concern for the Palestinians, as I've watched over the years, is that Israel points often to the example of America's indigenous populations and what happened to them. And if, at very best, the hope is to end up on reservations, this is a serious issue. So what's the plan, folks? And this follows on your question. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to just rephrase some of these questions. Questions on the Gulf state. The theory is that the Gulf states and Israel have a common goal, which is Iran, defeating Iran, controlling Iran, etc. And so they're willing to basically throw the Palestinians under the bus in order to do that. So will there, and the concern is that there will be pressure on Palestinians to accept a solution because the Arab states the big boys are coming in to pressure the Palestinians to do something that they don't necessarily want. Do you see that happening, and how do you kind of push back against that? What is the alternative if that indeed does happen? That's one question. Jewish and American, Jewish Palestinian, pro-Palestinian groups working together. I think that does happen, but we'll also, do they need to do more work together? And your question about pressure on the negotiations, right? And I will open it up. Who would like to
take the Gulf one. On the Gulf question, I would like to take it because I have been following closely. It relates to just the general relationship of the Palestinians with Arab regimes versus the Arab population. So Arab populations are supportive of Palestinians. The Arab regimes see Palestinians as, at best, an asset, at worst, a liability, right? So even the creation of the PLO was in fact an Arab attempt to contain Palestinian militias, right? Now, the Palestinians leveraged that in order to get in 1970, it was established in 1965, and then in 1974, they extracted the recognition of the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people, right? So that's an important aspect of the relationship of Palestinians with the Arabs. The Arabs, while in general supportive, they also saw it as a liability because, I mean, it's a non-state actor. They want to make sure they don't end up in a war were not ready for with Israel, right? And that's exactly what happened, right? So when it comes to the Gulf, right? So the Gulf was supportive of the PLO. The main funders were Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Arafat stood with Saddam in the Kuwait war, so they cut that money. Of course, again, taking the Palestinian perspective, Arafat couldn't do anything else because Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip were supportive of Saddam because Saddam said that, we have chemical weapons that can burn half of Israel, right? And this was happening at the height of the Intifada in the West Bank, so they thought, Saddam was so supportive of the Palestinians. So these calculations, Arafat had to make that calculation in his relationship with the Gulf and did away with his relationship with Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in order to because he was in Tunis, right? In order to maintain his legitimacy with the Palestinians. Now, fast forward to the 2000s, the Gulf states' main issue is Iran. And they do have more in common with Israel vis-a-vis Iran than they have with the Palestinians. So I'm not divulging any secrets. It was MBS that sanctioned the Jerusalem move. Like he okayed it when the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, right? And the pressure is coming from MBS on Abu Mazen to basically accept what is thrown at him. Because as far as MBS is concerned, the PLO and the Palestinians are becoming a liability, right? And the other wrinkle in that is that they are looking for other assets, so support for Hamas and other groups is also seen in that light. How can we utilize the Palestinian card, because it happens to be a useful card, how do we create assets and how do you use it? I'll stop at that.
I'll jump in on that real quick and move on to other ones. I think a lot of Arab governments are squeezed between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, wanting to maintain a close relationship with the United States and being concerned about Iran, and on the other hand, not wanting to throw the Palestinians under the bus, not because of genuine interest, but because they know it doesn't play well with their populations. It's, just abandoning the Palestinians basically does not play well, and therefore that they have that concern, and they're trying to figure out a way to thread that needle and remain in the middle of it. But assuming the worst case scenario, let's imagine that a lot of Arab governments endorse this peace plan and put pressure on the Palestinians to engage with it seriously. The question ultimately is, can this peace plan lead to actual peace? If Abu Mazen were to sign this deal, is that the end of the conflict? And frankly, the answer is obviously no. I mean, it doesn't matter who signs what. At the end of the day, in order for peace to be sustainable, it has to have some level of justice to the people who are the victims of it. And if you leave the Palestinians with nothing but crumbs, it's only a matter of time before violence breaks out again. So in a sense, I'm less alarmed about this entire development because ultimately I don't think that it's going to make that big a difference in the long term. The whole slogan of no justice, no peace is really at the root of everything here, in that who signs what is not important, who comes to negotiate over what is not important in the short term. What we need to do is build a vision about what is going to really solve this conflict in the long term. And people who are serious about resolving it would have to get behind that at one point or another. On the question of Arabs and Jews working together, frankly, I see it more often than not. I don't go to a Palestine protest anywhere without probably seeing more American Jews who are involved in these kinds of protests. There's organizations like Jewish Force for Peace that are really active. We work with a lot of these groups. So I think that this kind of collaboration, maybe it needs a little bit more visibility, but I definitely think that it happens a lot. And just the last thing that I'll say about sort of the tension within the people who are doing solidarity work with Palestine and activism on behalf of Palestine. Again, I think that tension is real. It exists, and people have different strategies and different ideas. And you have people who, I've seen people on Twitter, sometimes prominent pro-Palestine advocates, who denounce other BDS advocates because they don't support the most complete vision of BDS. You're not in favor of cultural boycott, you only want to boycott settlement products or whatever, then you have this kind of tension. But at the end of the day, when somebody like Natalie Portman takes the most minimal aspect of BDS, simply refuses to attend an event because Netanyahu is going to be at it, everybody celebrates this as a BDS victory. Well, fine, if this is a BDS victory, which I absolutely believe it is, then we have to have that expansive vision of what BDS is, and frankly, an expansive vision of what pro-Palestine advocacy is generally. As long as we're pushing in the same direction, I think that that's good enough.
I think that's such an important point. Do we have, how are we looking on time, Kristen? Oh, great. Any more questions? Okay, over there.
Ed Brighton, Veterans for Peace. Could you talk a little bit about the leadership that might be in jail in Israel? And should that be more of a focus? What are the risks to leaders coming up, either from internally, from PLO competition, or from outside?
Very good question.
And just as a host ad, can you include Ahed Tamimi in that discussion? Was there another question?
I've noticed that there's discrepancies in language. When you see resolutions or draft proposals or policy making, they don't say the word Palestinian or Palestine. They'll use the word Arab. Is there a reason why they don't claim Palestinians or say Palestine and will say Arabs or the Arab nation?
Anybody who hasn't asked a question before? Over there. I'm going to get back to you.
Sorry, I didn't see the hand.
Oh, over here.
Hello. What I feel like what I'm hearing here is I'm hearing, in the context of American politics, I'm hearing never-Trumpers and those people who just believe sincerely Hillary won and the person in the White House is a fraud, shouldn't be there. You can say that, but in fact, he's there. And so there are a lot of, it may feel good, but it's a reality there. And in that same sense, I think Israel is going to continue pretty much the way it is, no matter what. Now, Israel's need is not peace with the PLO or Gaza. Israel needs peace with the Ummah. That's the only thing it needs. The whole world, if there's any place that wants to, if PLO makes peace with Israel but Gaza doesn't, that doesn't help Israel. I mean, that helps a little bit, but that really doesn't solve any problems. And so I guess what I'd like to hear you address is, I mean, is it really worthwhile? I mean, to me, the other analogy is I feel like I'm hearing Maxine Waters up here, who is never, ever going to accept Trump as president. And so
I'm sorry, what is your
I feel like,
question?
is your position an anti-Maxi, her approach saying never, ever give in is good for the Palestinians?
Okay. All right.
You spoke about the Gulf's role in the Palestinian question, but could you speak a little bit on Jordan's role in that as well?
And the last question over here.
This is a question about the BDS movement that has been mentioned multiple times. Are we giving a little more weight to the BDS movement because of desperation and search of leadership? Because the history of the BDS movement, it goes beyond the Palestinian issue and goes back to South Africa. So it seems like it's a grassroots movement that's not necessarily advocating or trying to be to apply itself as leadership in Palestine. So are we just giving more weight to it, or a different role than what it actually should be playing?
All right. So questions on Palestinian leadership in jail, including Ahed Tamimi, on whether this is whether Palestinians should kind of accept the reality of Israel and what kind of compromises do the Palestinians need to do, the role of Jordan, and whether BDS is given too much weight because of the lack of alternatives. So who would like to take?
I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
So quickly, just to answer, provide information on issues. On Palestinian leadership, like any power, people in power are not interested in other people getting into power. And with lack of solid institutions, they're always going to try to undermine others, right? So people like Ahed Tamimi and, or like even, let's start before that, Barghouti, who's in jail, right? He's very popular. And in fact, in all the polls, when people poll, he is the number one that would be elected as president. Of course, Abu Mazen is not happy with that, right? And therefore, the people the Palestinians who are in prison do have higher legitimacy in the eye of the Palestinians. In fact, part of the pressure for the Fatah and Hamas to reconcile came from the prisoners' document. It was Barghouti and Hamas leaders in Israeli jails that came up with the terms of that agreement, and the leadership of Hamas and Fatah outside had to comply because they cannot be seen as disagreeing with the prisoners who are paying a heavy price, right? Now, have people like Ahed Tamimi and others who are doing phenomenal work as a nonviolence movement. The challenge with the nonviolence movement is that it is fragmented. Now, until last month, I would have told you that that was a problem because you have each of these villages working alone and they're not getting traction. But a friend of mine is actually working on a thesis that there is something called chaotic or non-organized nonviolence that they think is in fact more effective. Rather than having an organized system that has hierarchy that can be decapitated or in fact any structure could be destroyed, it's in fact so organic, it's completely unorganized and very, ad hoc. And that might be a secret sauce of people in general being on the same wavelength, but then doing literally their own thing, all towards the same direction, but without actual coordination, that can be an asset for the leadership. Why is that important? Because the challenge, and I've been working with a lot of nonviolence initiatives in Palestine and in fact here, both Hamas and Fatah either want to co-opt or want to destroy that movement. Because if they're not with them, they are automatically considered as against them. Because both Hamas and Fatah are happy where they are, and in fact are colluding, in a sense, to make sure that there isn't a third party. Not very different from the States, for that matter, why we don't have a third party in the United States. So that's a dynamic that's important to understand. On Jordan, the Jordanian, in general, want a two-state solution because the majority of Jordanians are, in fact, from Palestinian descent, and the Israeli, right-wing Israeli narrative of Jordan is Palestine actually does scare daylight from the Jordanians. So the Jordanians are invested in the two-state solution precisely because there are ramifications to Jordan itself. On the Trump reality, I didn't mean to, if it came across like that, that wasn't intended. Definitely, Trump is a reality, and that's what we're reacting to. That Trump is a definite watershed of separation from literally decades of American policy that was a pro-negotiated solution and like keeping distance from the parties equally. The difference is, up until Trump, all American presidents, maybe save for Carter, were in fact in rhetoric saying they're keeping the same distance, but indeed actually supporting Israel unequivocally. Trump actually is transparent enough to actually be coherent in the rhetoric and the actions. So from a Palestinian perspective, Trump at least is clear. So now that it's clear to everyone that the US is unequivocally, categorically on the Israeli camp, ergo they cannot be, they've renounced or they've rescinded their role as a mediator. Okay, that's it. Oh, no, one final thing about the Ummah, you're right, sorry. There is a school of thought, there's a narrative in Israel that believes it will never be accepted. Therefore, we need to live by the sword, right? So there are a lot of Israelis, in fact, arguably now they are the majority and they are in power, that think negotiations is a fool's errand, and in fact is dangerous. And therefore, we need not talk to the Palestinians. What we need to have is every 10, 15 years, we'll have a war, we'll pacify them, but we will never have a time when the Arabs will accept us. To answer your questions about Arabs, that narrative is precisely why they call them Arabs and not Palestinians, because the argument is there are 22 other Arab nations. The Palestinians can go there and have their state. We need our Jewish state. We're barely 27 square kilometers. They have 300 million kilometers. Why do they need to live in ours? They can be in Jordan, they can be Lebanon, they can be in Syria, right? So that's where you're correct, that the American politics with the current Israeli government is definitely in line of there is no need to talk to the Palestinians. Let's talk to the Arabs, right? We have interest with them, and we'll just manage the Palestinians. So the problem is too many key actors are perfectly fine with conflict management because they believe they can continuously run the affairs of the Palestinians and keep them submissive, even if they are a majority. The other school of thought, the peace camp, let's say, in Israel, came to a rational decision that it cannot sustain the occupation. It cannot indefinitely rule over the Palestinians. They might not like relinquishing land, but it's not sustainable to continue the occupation. That group of people are a minority now in Israel, and that's why you don't see a prospect for the peace process. Thank you.
I want to talk about the BDS and activism. It's not the only source of activism. It's not the only way that Palestinians can move to a just solution. It's one of the major aspects of pressuring Israel to do what's right for the Palestinians. Activism is another one with Palestinian and Jewish peace movements and putting pressure on the Israeli lobby and on the Israelis in the diaspora, grassroots organizations, people living in the West Bank and Gaza, again, are the ones who can move the political movement towards peace and justice. But also, why does the U.S. have to dictate what peace is and what happens to Israel-Palestine? There's the EU, and there's a lot of very strong nations who can come up with a different peace plan and present it instead of just working off what Israel and the U.S. have come up with.
Great. Thank you, Rola. Omar, do you have anything to add? Go ahead.
I do, yes, please. Just before I get to this question, I want to address a couple of things from the back. You mentioned about why the word Arab is used rather than the word Palestine, and that is absolutely by design. There's a lot of research that is being done by groups like the Israel Project and others, where they basically test what different words, what impact they have on focus groups and what might play better with the American public. And they've determined that the word Palestinian evokes images of victimhood, and that's not good, and the word Arab triggers images of oil sheiks and what have you, and therefore that's a better word to use in order to shift sympathies in a certain direction. There's an entire body of research on this that really, once you study it and you start listening to Israeli occupation apologists on TV, you see the consistency of the terminology that is being used. It's absolutely breathtaking. On the issue of BDS, I think it is correct to say that sometimes its power is being exaggerated, and that it is still many, many, many miles away from ever being at the point where it actually impacts Israel's policy in a meaningful way, where Israel is reconsidering the occupation because of BDS. We're not anywhere close to it. However, the extent to which you're seeing, the extent of the hostility, Israeli hostility towards BDS, where they're engaging in efforts to criminalize it even here in the United States, they're lobbying for these efforts, tells you that they see this as a strategic long-term threat, is that even though we're not there yet, the movement has the potential of getting there, and that's why they're trying to stop it in its tracks really early on. On the Maxine Waters stuff and Trump, and I think if I understood you correctly, you were suggesting that just like unreasonable liberals need to come to terms with the fact that Trump is president, they have to live with it, unreasonable Palestinians or whatever have to come to terms with the fact that Israel exists. Am I understanding this correctly? All right. So I think we should be absolutely clear about the fact that the Palestinians recognized Israel in 1988, and for literally decades, that's on 78% of historic Palestine, right? They settled for 22% of historic Palestine, and they were later joined by the entire Arab world through the Arab Peace Initiative that said in exchange for an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, we will fully normalize relations with Israel. And throughout the entire negotiations, the only people who were being asked to compromise on anything were the Palestinians. You know, international law says the occupied territories do not belong to Israel. Israel has to leave the occupied territories. And what was being negotiated on was which settlements Israel was going to vacate, which part of East Jerusalem that Israel was going to hold on to, and how many refugees they were going to allow to return. So in effect, while Israel was not being asked to make any compromises whatsoever, the entire discussion was about how many compromises the Palestinians were going to make about their rights in order to reach an agreement with Israel. And what the Palestinians are insisting on, despite bending over backwards to try to resolve this conflict, is that at the end of the day, you can't take our basic freedom away from us. And I think that when we reach a point where the demand for basic freedom becomes seen as unreasonable, I think that really tells you everything about how distorted the narrative that we generally have about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict generally is. That it really is a testament to Israel's apologists that they got us to the point to where a Palestinian demand for freedom is seen as unreasonable.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Ahmad. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to our panelists. And thank you to the Foundation of Middle East Peace and MEI and the Palestinian Museum for hosting this.